Hey everybody, this is Dr. Matt, and I'm going to talk with you a little bit about case study one, and hopefully this will help you get going on your paper. And I'm going to talk through the syllabus and an example of some casework that you can use as a guideline. And I'm looking at the syllabus on page 5. And I have laid out 7 different points that should guide you through the structure of the paper. And feel free to use those 7 points as a framework for your paper if you'd like to. And in the first point, I am asking you just to summarize the narrative of the paper, of the scene in which your character is featured. So, for example, I could choose a scene from the TV show Transparent. And in season 1, uh, I can't remember which episode, Moira, who is a 70-something-year-old Jewish transgender identified woman who is transitioning from being a male identified person to a female identified person. And while she is fully identified as transgender, she is not yet out to her family. And she's very anxious about disclosing her gender identity to her family, and is conflicted about that, would like to, and has gathered her family together for this dinner in which she's going to use the occasion to come out. And in this scene, the family is gathered. There are three adult children, and as Moira is attempting to disclose her gender identity, she stalls and can't quite find the words. The family comes up with various associations. They wonder if Moira is coming out with some kind of health problem, like whether she has cancer or not. And eventually the scene ends by Moira stating, no, she doesn't have cancer, she's selling the house. And that's the end of the scene. So that would basically be a summary of the narrative. It's just telling the story of the scene and setting it up for the reader. The second section is to utilize Freudian psychological theory, as we've discussed, looking at conscious and unconscious levels of the drama, looking at the interpersonal and intrapersonal conscious and unconscious conflict. And it's in this section that I would also like you to consider what psychosexual stage of development may be presenting itself in the conflict, the intrapsychic conflict. So, for example, in this scene, I would say the conscious level of the conflict is that Moira is conflicted about whether to come out to her family or not, and there's an air of suspense and mystery and anxiety about that. And Moira is conscious of her own ambivalence about coming out. So that's the conscious level. The unconscious level of the scene is that Moira um, is struggling with her own this is my guess, but that Moira is struggling with an attack an internal attack against her own sense of value and validity and um, and safety within the context of her family as a transgender person, and so there's an internal struggle about trust versus mistrust. There's also an internal struggle around shame and autonomy. In other words, can she, to what degree is she autonomous from her family? And to what degree is she feeling stuck, almost like a young child in a who is projecting onto her family perhaps a shaming parental figure or bullying peer from her childhood that has been internalized and is being um, is getting expressed in this family dynamic. I would also wonder if there is an oral stage uh, conflict. So trust and mistrust tend to reflect oral stage issues. And the scene, interestingly, is about eating. They're at the dinner table, and you see that there's a lot of messiness in the eating. They're eating like a barbecue dinner of some kind, and Moira has food, has some like barbecue sauce around her lips, and so do other family members. And that's a kind of a pointer or a symbol of a kind of, you could say, an attention toward oral stage conflict. At least that would be one consideration. Um, there's also perhaps there can be multiple stages of psychosexual development issues. You can just choose one, but I would also maybe wonder about the shame level, and that isn't shame is associated with the anal stage. And so you see the messiness in this case could also be a kind of the internal mess or the sense of disarray that that whining sound, by the way, is my dog who's dreaming and having some kind of he's probably guarding the house in his dreams, which is so adorable, actually, as we speak, right? So if anyone was wondering, dogs also have unconscious life. That's a complete side note. So I'm talking about the presence of an anal stage conflict. So anal stage tends to have to do with what control, cleanliness, order, um, shame, autonomy, setting boundaries. Those are all themes that are associated with the anal stage. And so here uh, you have Moira attempting to sort of, let's say, get her life together, sort of to clean up her act, as it were. And in fact, it's kind of a mess. And so that's the other side, is that things are kind of out of control. She's trying to get it under control, but things are actually out of control. And there are other levels, including Oedipal level, which could be discussed here, but I'm not going to sort of further layer the scene. That's certainly plenty. It's probably much more than you would need um, to put into this particular section, but I'm riffing. So the third section of the paper, you consider any cultural or diversity issues relevant to this scene psychodynamically, like gender, sexual orientation, race, and so on, and how they're being expressed consciously and unconsciously, and what does the scene reflect about neurosis in society. So I've already talked about the gender identity issue, in the narrative, and it may be that some of those issues get taken up in the first couple of sections, but here I really want you to focus on it. And so, for example, in this scene, I would more specifically talk about um, gender identity, about internalized transphobia. I would talk about social norms, including um, uh, cisgender normativity, and that's kind of a technical term, but in other words, the how being a biologically, how having your gender associated with your biology is considered normative in this culture, meaning in a Judeo-Christian dominant American cultural context. Um, and so that this clearly is a kind of a flashpoint for the scene in which you have this attempt of the main character Moira to sort of consciously embody this being a male, which is to conform to social norms and pressures, and is unconsciously battling this internalized transphobia that is completely overwhelming her and her capacity to be authentic in her own family, which is clearly reflective also of a societal conflict at this level, a society that is very much at war with itself about trying to understand the complexity of gender. And for example, you can see this in many ways, including even controversies about whether there ought to be bathrooms that are designated um, gender neutral. So I'm going on to section 4, and I'm discussing defensive operations engaged in the scene. So I'm just talking about defensive operations that your character may be utilizing. So in this case, for example, Moira is utilizing denial. Um, Maybe some part of denial in which she's denying her own, denying to the family at least, her own true identity as a transgender woman. And at the same time, at some level, she may be using suppression, which is different than denial. Denial means that there is no awareness of what's being defended against. Suppression is that there's an awareness of what's being defended against, but it's being pushed down. It doesn't want to be shared. And I would suggest that there's probably both of those occurring. Um, I'm guessing that there's also the use of projection in the scene, and that she is projecting that the family is judging her when in fact she may be judging the family and their ability to be um, empathic and understanding toward her. Um, Now, some of that concern is validated as we find out later in the story. The family is in fact uh, struggling with their own ability to be accepting of Moira, but at the same time, there is probably more capacity within the family to accept her than she realizes, or even that the family realizes, at least at the beginning of the story. In question 5, I'm asking to discuss your transference to the scene, discuss what you notice activated from your own unconscious process, including both a personal and cultural level of response. What is touch for you personally, and how this informs your perception of the scene. Analyze your own defenses in relation to the scene. Okay, so I'll discuss this a little bit. Um, Take a pause. Wow. So basically, the question is asking you to look at what is coming between you and your ability to see your character or your client as clearly as possible. What unconscious interference may be occurring, and how can that get noted? So for me, in this instance, I would say that um, I'm immediately taken into my own association to coming out to my family as a gay man uh, in my young adulthood, and how terribly conflicted I was about that, and how many times I attempted to come out and kind of backed off and veiled the truth or lied outright in order to try to protect myself from what I imagine would be a very negative response to my family. So that's being activated for me. And I would say there's also, at a cultural level, I would say that there's my own transphobia that is activated by this scene. I very much have been socialized to see gender in a very binary way. And at least in my own early upbringing, there was certainly no space at all, or no visibility at all, at least in the world that I knew, for what is now understood as transgender or transsexual folk. Um, so that's a limitation that I encounter internally, and how to notice my own conditioning at play. So in a way, Moira is mirroring back to me my own internal conflict, and that can also potentially be a source of empathy and understanding for her concern. Um, what I notice is that the last part of this question and the next question, in fact, are a little bit redundant. So I'm asking you to look at how your defensive style is is informing the scene, and analyzing your own defenses in relation to the scene. So I'm just going to go to number 6 and just encourage you to mostly I want you to see that your own defenses may be at play. So for example, I may be wanting to deny that I have transphobia at all, and I prefer to see myself as more accepting and more enlightened and so on. But in fact, I do have this conditioning that's at play. So I would need to be careful or mindful of the way in which my own tendency to want to be liked and to want to be seen as a socially progressive and so on may interfere with my own ability to recognize my own limitations, uh, and the way that transphobia may, for example, get mobilized in the uh, work that I would do with Myra, and also the way in which I might be perceiving what's going on in the scene. And of course, that also bears on my cultural self. In fact, it's so largely informed by my cultural self, as I just described, coming from a cultural point of view in which gender was seen in an absolutely exclusively binary way. I mean, I didn't mention this, but it does bear on the scene as well. The scene is about a Jewish family and a Jewish family system, and I came from a Jewish family system as well. And so there's very much this sense of the agonizing tension between a kind of traditional Jewish uh, view of the world, um, and the sacredness of the body and gender and heterosexuality and sort of a normative view of gender. That was all considered to be, and is still considered to be, at least from a traditional Jewish perspective, um, very important principles and guiding principles for one to be sort of favored by God. And so to part from those particular principles is to, in fact, at least from a Jewish paradigm, is to sort of risk the ostracism from the tribe and even from the sense of God's love. And so there's a lot at stake there. Now, whether that's my particular belief system currently or not, which it isn't, nevertheless, that generational influence is still very much a part of my own unconscious life, and it's important for me to be aware of that in this instance. And so finally, in the 7th part, I'm asking you to discuss the clinical relevance of your findings and how you can see insights gained through your analysis of the scene. So I'm asking you to now transpose the scene into a clinical context. So take it out of the fictional setting and then putting it into another fictional setting, which is imagining that you're working with this client. So I imagine that I'm working with Moira clinically, and how would it be now sitting across from her and talking with her? Perhaps she's talking to me about how upsetting it was for her to want to come out to her family, and she found herself unable to do it. In fact, she does talk to a character in the story about just that. But I'm imagining that we would have this hypothetical conversation. And how might this discussion of the scene help me work with Moira? So I've talked about perhaps the value of noticing my own transference, in other words, noticing my own limitations and being open-minded to her true gender, and that might be a source of interference. I also noticed that by struggling with my own transphobia, I might very well be more open and empathic to her own struggle, and certainly hopefully less judgmental about what she's struggling with. In the worst case, for example, I might get impatient with her, and let's say if I weren't in touch with my own struggle about that, I might say, well, what's the problem? Why can't you just be more honest with your family? That wouldn't that be very helpful for you and for your family as well? And in fact, that kind of intervention would be probably very off base in this case. And so that's an example of how working with my own countertransference could help me understand the dynamics of a similar clinical situation. And so what I've just discussed is probably much longer than a 3 to 4 page paper, but it certainly gives you some food for thought. And as I say, the intention of this paper is to help you gain practice writing and thinking in a psychodynamic manner. So I mostly just want you to find a way to apply this theory in a way that feels very real to you, authentic to you, and practical from a clinical perspective. I do want you to use APA guidelines. If you're unclear about what that means, I do encourage you to refer back to your own resources or to even to search APA guidelines online. I'm not going to be super meticulous about that, but what I am really concerned about is that you can clearly show when you're citing an outside source, you're citing a text, and that you use a reference list. Otherwise, it's considered plagiarism. I am asking you to make use of any of the readings that we've used so far to help bolster or support any part of your discussion. So for example, when I was talking about anal stage issues, I could look at the Berzov text, I could pull some part of the Berzov text that talks about anal stage and let's say trust, and I could insert a quote there. When I'm talking about transphobia, I could look at the readings or find an outside reading and I could insert a quote there in the body of the text, and then in the final part of the text, I would, at the very end of the paper, I would have a reference list. I hope that's given you some guidance, and I'm always open to further questions if you should have them. Thank you.